Most people don't think of strategy that way.
Developing a new strategy.
Strategic blind spots.
When strategy meets reality.
Strategy and innovations.
In the strategy world.
Drive their strategic goals.
And welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. Welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Lasse Jonasson. I hope I pronounced that right. I think there's going to be a whole clip thing of me in these episodes about mispronunciation of people's names, so I do apologise. But it's fantastic to have you on the show. And just for our listeners, do you mind giving a bit of background and a bit of context about what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, happy to be here. And you can call me or pronounce my name in any way. I'm used to people not being very crisp on this Danish pronunciation. Lasse Jonasson is the way I pronounce it, and I'm from the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, where I'm a CFO, and usually people think that equates to Chief Financial Officer. In my case, it's Chief Foresight Officer, so CFO of the future, one might say. And I think, I'm less interesting, and I think the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies is a more interesting topic. So more on that. We're an independent, non-profit think tank founded back in 1999, where we were founded with the purpose of understanding the future and basically predicting what is coming. After a few decades, we realized we cannot predict the future, so we stopped doing that and instead trying to understand potential futures, and that's also in our name, Copenhagen Institute for Futures, in plural studies, and that's basically what we do today. We work with different organizations, helping them to understand what is ahead and also helping them position themselves towards those potential futures. So in the field of foresight, that's where our core competence is, working with a lot of different actors, both leaders wanting to get with their strategy, but also foresight practitioners who wants to get some sparring on how to work with foresight.
Yeah, sound. Yeah, I think that foresight is one of those elements in the strategic process that I think is underestimated. I think people talk about it, the future, but I think they fall into that trap of that you said about trying to predict the future, which we know we can't do. So what are the things you think that sort of prevent or make it difficult for people to use futures in organizations?
Yeah, first of all, it's abstract, right? As you said, it's difficult to predict the future, and it's difficult to speak about the future. And what is the future? I mean, 5 minutes out, that's the future. Usually we try to look much further ahead, so 5, 10, 20 years out. So one thing is, what is the future? And I would say for us, the way we try to define it is in the time horizon within which your organization is beginning to be exposed to some external elements that would require other than just linear thinking. So more radical futures that will have a significant impact on your organization. So I think we lack a language, we lack a discipline, and it's a little bit cultural, difficult to accept this uncertainty. So usually I say that for me, not having structured work around the foresight dimension is corresponding to leaders getting into a room, looking at each other and say, let's discuss last year's financial results, and then say, it's not that we have any financial controller or bookkeeper in the room. No. Let's just discuss intuitively what did happen, right? No one would do that, seriously.
Yeah.
But I do think the future is at least as important as the past. So actually having a structured approach to potential futures that will open up for a conversation around the future, because that's also the challenge, right? It's the conversation in many leadership groups about the future is juvenile, to say it directly. Because if you don't have a language, then you cannot speak very efficiently about the future. Let's say, now I use the example of financial numbers. Let's say you didn't have a word for revenues or EBITDA, just a complex. Then you say EBITDA, everyone knows what you're speaking about. And that's because you have spent quite a lot of time understanding what's behind that term.
Yes.
So we need to have that in the future. We have to have outspoken assumptions about the future so we can discuss that more structured.
Yeah. And I think, over the last 2 decades, I think a lot of the management thinking has spent a lot of time on, perfecting sort of the structures of organization, the management of organization. And, we've got some great work on futures, but I don't think it's really sort of come into the mainstream to perfect that language and that shared understanding. But I think it's really important, because you've only got to look, and you're in the midst of this, and I'm not sure roughly when this is going to go out, so it might be a bit dated on this subject. But just thinking about you're in Denmark, the issue with Greenland, the issue with our sort of powers around the world changing what we always thought to be true and factual, and those governing constraints, those constraints that we thought that were untouchable, they are now moving them or testing them. And this is really crucial, because if we don't have the language to look ahead of the future, we can't really understand, well, what would happen if these things did shift? What would emerge? What would that mean for the futures? And I think then if we don't do that, we're just sort of going into or allowing the future to come to us quite blind.
Yeah, fully agree. And I would say most events you only understand in hindsight, right? Let's take the Berlin Wall. When that happened, what was the consequences? Now, when we look back and say the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was quite clear. It led to this, and that. So basically, the consequences and the importance on an event is only understood with hindsight, because you know what it led to. And I would say that's why futures thinking is actually extremely powerful, because if you do some futures thinking, then you work on scenarios which might be the consequences of events happening today. And through those scenarios, you can see the potential of those events. You might not be right, but you have an idea about it. So actually, to understand the present, you need to have an historical, literacy, but also what we call a futures literacy. So you need to understand what will be the potential consequences of what is happening here. And that's exactly what you also mentioned there. We have some quite solid assumptions that are very implicit in our thinking. One of those might be that we have a world where people are respecting the overall dynamics, the laws, the geopolitical tensions, are keeping us in some kind of a predictable behavior. And what if that is not true? Then we need to have some optionality here, which is inconvenient to think about. It doesn't feel nice. And first of all, sometimes you're just not aware of your assumptions. It's hidden assumptions that are actually the basis of your strategy or whatever you are going.
And I think that's really crucial. There are really good things there. One thing I'd pick up first, and this is where I first came onto your work, was you've done an article about gamification of futures or simulation of futures. And I think it's that because we hold those implicit assumptions, there's no way of really challenging those. And that's where future thinking really helps, because you have different perspectives in the rooms. It's not just you going, I wonder what the future is. It's really a collaborative thing where we're challenging. What are you seeing? What we're using that cognitive creative capacity of people. And I think that's really challenges, because that'd be interesting to me. Why are you seeing that and I'm not? Why do you believe that and I don't? And I think that whole bit about surfacing those tensions
Yeah.
and then being able to run those scenarios in a way that people can get involved, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And we all have assumptions about the future. And the power comes when we actually reveal those assumptions, when we get a language for those assumptions. So we understand that when we are discussing a potential entry in a new market, for example, a strategy, and then it's because my assumption is that we will have a much more open economy. And I believe we need to go into that market, whereas your assumption might be that will not happen. So we don't agree in the actual, elements of the strategy. It's because we have different assumptions. And very often, now this is, one assumption and one quite clear example, which would be revealed in our conversation. But what we see very often is, for example, when we go into organizations, we very often, as a fundamental layer, before we do our work, our analysis and futures work, we do some interviews, qualitatively based interviews, where we try to reveal the assumptions about the future. And now geopolitics is one area. Of course, AI is very high on the agenda for most people. And if you just ask, do you think AI is impactful? Everyone will say yes. Have you considered a lot about the impact of AI? All leaders would say yes, or 9 out of 10, right? But if you go further into that, most leaders have spent all their cognitive power on understanding how AI can change what they do today.
Yes.
How they can make things faster, cheaper, better. Whereas what really would be powerful about AI, I believe, is when we start doing things differently, when we start making new processes, when we start making new business models, interact in new ways. And in order to understand those dynamics, there are so many uncertainties, so many assumptions. So you need to work with scenarios. You need to spend a lot of time getting rid of the assumption that, we as people are the smartest entities here, that we have as people are, a keystone in all communication. So when you get rid of that, you will see totally new, very different futures emerge. And if you spend a lot of time doing that, Mike, and I haven't, then again, our strategy conversation about the next move becomes, so difficult because our assumptions about the future is so profoundly different.
Yes. And I think that's really important because those assumptions, they sort of boundary what we see as possible. And I think that, you can still have your assumptions and your beliefs, but it's about, let's set them aside to let's think about what would happen if that assumption wasn't there. And I think that's where the real stretching conversation goes. And I think sometimes I've seen organizations we've done futures, and I see a couple of faults. One is that they're overly optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
So they've created this optimistic view of the future that's, is not going to be challenged. Or they've gone really dystopian. So that, the whole world's burning down because AI is here. And the final one is that they haven't attached what the futures are, the scenarios they've done, with decisions that they are making today. There seems to be this void. It's almost the future's over there. We'll just carry on doing. They've not made that connection between the decisions that them reveals in today.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. And to give you an example, we're working with one of the world's largest retailers, and they wanted to improve their capabilities within Foresight. They established a dedicated Foresight function. And then we had a discussion around what would be a good starting point to work with Foresight and introduce that to the top management. And we agreed to have to futures test the current strategy, which was a 3 to 5 year strategy. And then we said, okay, let's do some interviews with the strategy team and some key points in top management, and ask them about the assumptions about the future 10 years out in your industry. And what came out was, sophisticated thoughts. People have spent time thinking about that. Then we took what came out here, looked at the strategy and said, does this 3 to 5 year strategy, which was a few years in, so even shorter term, does that address those assumptions about the future, which is, first of all, AI will fundamentally change the customer relationship. Everybody, not everybody, but most of the leaders addressed that. But in the strategy, that wasn't addressed because that's an uncertainty. We don't know how it's happening. Okay, so that your business model needs to, with high likelihood, fundamentally change. But you haven't addressed that. So you're basically kicking the ball to corner, if that's a way. You say that in Danish. I don't know if you say it in English.
No, it's all right. But you're right, because it's even with your strategy or your organization. We know that some organizations, their ability to change is painfully slow and it's not as quick as, and I think they don't do the foresight, so they're blind to it. So they're constantly then forced to react, which one, they don't have the capacity to do because they're so lean. They haven't got the speed to do it, so they'll miss out. And 3, they can't handle the destabilization that causes in the organization.
No.
Where even as you scenario or stress test your strategy, it's also your organization. Under these scenarios, what elements of our organization would be still the same? What still exists roughly across these? And then what would change across these various? Then you could start seeing that there's elements of your organisation that will probably sustain. So I'll carry on investing in that. And there's other bits where you go, well, that's going to change. What do we need to know to enable that, to let us know that that's changing? And then how quick can we do that? So what time lag do we need? And I think this then really involves people, because you go, well, let's look for these things. We're looking for these things. And I know then if we see these things, we can start to decline this and grow this element.
Yeah. And what is keeping a lot of leaders, I think, away from working with this is, first of all, the analogy to organizations has for decades been that we're a great machine. Right?
Yeah.
And if you are a machine, then processes are predictable, and what you do here and now would also be predictable. Also, that we don't want to infuse too much uncertainty into our employees. And I think the analogy should be better caught from biology, from ecosystems, that we are complex, dynamic systems, that we should work with thesis on where we're heading, but we also need optionality. And as a leader, you don't have all the answers. So I think that there's this, in many cases, false assumption that if you reveal that some of the future scenarios are negative, then everyone will live in uncertainty and be nervous and so forth. But I mean, usually stress is a phenomenon where you're exposed to uncertainty where you cannot do anything about it.
Yes. Yeah.
But if you expose your employees and the organization to uncertainty and say, we actually are working actively with this, I think it will be much more comfortable than if you know by yourself that AI is happening. There's a geopolitical crisis, but my management is just working towards those utopian vision that we established 3 years ago. I mean, that just don't feel comfortable at all.
No. And I write about this often. I call it strategic ambiguity. Yeah. And then you need to embrace ambiguity in uncertainty, because too much clarity can be dangerous. Because as soon as you start to go too much clarity, you start to narrow that vision, and you start to live in a world where you think that things are predictable, where actually a bit of ambiguity is good because it opens up opportunities. But to match with that, you have to have the conditions where people can adapt.
Yeah, but that's actually interesting. So you and I totally agree on that. How many do you think would disagree in that conversation? Would you say they disagree, or do you think they would just don't have focus on this, so it's kind of like a blind spot?
I think if you, from my experience, if you draw it down and you explain it, I think it makes sense to people. But I think we're going against the grain in all the sort of literature around sort of effective management and strategy, which is always about, perfect alignment, clarity. You've got to give clarity on everything. And I think that skews what's actually really happening. And I think that lives in a world where, the world of linear causal relationship, you do this will happen, or the world is stable, or the world's predictable, that stuff will work. But I think there's a more nuanced argument, which we're talking about, which is more useful, but it does go in against the grain of traditional thinking.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wrote an article half a year ago, I think, about anticipatory leadership, where I tried to look through different literature around leadership, strategy, and scan for what are the assumptions about foresight, futures thinking in these different frameworks. And it was not that the literature said that the future is not important, right? It was addressed in many different frameworks, but I didn't find any of the popular strategy frameworks treating foresight as a discipline. It was more like, yes, you need to understand the future markets. And that's it, right? And okay, yeah, but how do you do that? How do you understand the futures market and blue ocean strategy? Yes, understand where it's still a market potential where you could sit alone and so forth. And the future is important. It's just not addressed as a discipline that you need to do your work, and you need to work with optionality, several futures and so forth. So it's kind of like a little bit just, it's complex, it's difficult, but of course it's important. But let's go on with the strategy.
It's the isolationist thinking that I keep seeing. So it's like they treat strategy as strategy, and I can go on all day about my views around a lot of the so-called models of strategy, but it's the same they do with execution. Is almost they talk about execution. Most strategy books talk about execution in like a pass-off paragraph, rather than realizing how intertwined the two are. You can't have one without the other. But that's the same with the external environment. Most strategy doesn't take into consideration much of the external environment other than a bit about markets, where actually the whole thing is so intertwined between the futures, the external environment, to the internal environment as well, our ability to execute. But they keep separating them as if they can survive on their own. It just doesn't happen. And when you talk about the future, they'll talk about in a narrow sense of like this market. We've seen this data tell us this market's going to grow by, X billion. So that's a good way to invest, rather than going, well, what's your assumptions about what's holding that market together?
Yeah.
And what would emerge if these assumptions were to change?
Yeah. And actually working with both elements, right? And saying, this is our thesis. Let's make a very concrete plan towards this. But then let's stress test and say, what needs to happen to convince us about this not being a good idea? What can we do then? What is our optionality? Who has the responsibility for realize when the assumptions are wrong? And how can we work on this? And if this is wrong, a strategy doesn't exist. It's not just a product of all the single plans, right? It's the dynamics. It's the synergies among that. And what happens if we take this out of the equation, right? It's a difficult conversation. It's complex. But I do think that is the dialogue you need to have. And very often when I speak about this topic, one thing is the very large organizations where they have a very structured strategy process. They have a whole department responsible for doing strategy. So they, of course, have processes and so forth. In minor organizations, they don't have this. There's the CEO or the management team is in charge of the strategy, but how do they run strategy? Very often that's actually much closer to what we speak about here, because they don't have formalized plans. They have optionality. They have ideas in their head and they tweak them. They don't make the specific plans, but sometimes they see and push things in one direction. Then it doesn't feel right for some reason. Let's twist that. So it's actually interesting to see the formalities. And what I'm saying here is also what I hear in a lot of the larger organizations, where they're a little bit, when they say it's not that we fully trust the strategy team in all circumstances, and they might just brought in once in a while, because strategy happens throughout all conversations. It's not just something that you put into the agenda in every third month or whatever.
Yeah, you're lucky even that. And I suppose you really good point about the formalization of strategy, because we were talking a little bit just before we came on about that, and I was saying about how strategy formed from an ability to sense, or in optionality, really understand the terrain. And in modern days, like in businesses, we don't have maps. We don't have maps of the terrain. The terrain is the future. So that is the map we're using. It's the ecosystem. It's the future. That's the map that we need to have some sort of understanding of. All the way to now, where it seems to be that strategy is an output. So you hear it in conversations. You hear the words, "Do we have a strategy?" And people may challenge me on language, but that to me represents that they have something like tangible in their hand, rather than a way of being to sense and create options.
Yeah, I fully agree. Then, can you show me your strategy? I mean, then people think about, yes, that's an execution plan, but is that the strategy? No, it's
no. It's a bit like we were talking about earlier with, a really crucial question I always ask organizations when we look at the future and the ecosystem. And normally I do a lot around modeling the ecosystem, and then we bring futures into that, because we go, well, with the assumptions we hold, how would this change? Because we've got fit here now, we're viable in this ecosystem now. If that changes, what's that mean to us, and where does that take us? And I always say that if we took this path, would we like what we become? And that's the identity question. You see this with Nvidia as a classic example. They started off as a game microchips, didn't they? And they didn't suddenly turn from that to a $4 trillion business doing the microchips for AI. That wasn't just done overnight. That has to have some sort of anticipation of futures, seeing opportunities, affordances that they took to change their identity.
Yeah, and of course it's also very tempting to look back and say, then we saw that and we moved ahead.
Post rationalization always happens.
Yeah. So very often when I had the conversation last week with a friend of mine who is advising top leaders, and we had the conversation around one leader that was without a job and thinking about where to go from now. And most leaders, when you hear, okay, then I took a few months out and I thought about what to do, and then I chose this and it went to this job and I took this decision. But you hear that in hindsight. When people, and then it becomes a very planned journey where they wanted to understand this and took this path and so forth. Whereas if you ask them when they are in it, both leaders and in strategy conversations, they don't say, now I'm fully confident. This is our strength. This is where we need to move. So 5 years from now, we will be the largest company in the world, right? That is not happening. That is hindsight, where you take that path and speak about it like it was obvious. And when you get exposed to those stories, it's also easy as a leader to be a little bit, overwhelmed and say, wow, someone out there sees things much clearer than I do.
Yes.
But they don't. I mean, there's no one who sees things one-dimensional and say there's only one option and we're heading for that. they are confused, but they also work with future scenarios. NVIDIA didn't figure out the whole journey from day one, but they worked on optionality and they saw potential. They pursued that. So without seeing the potential and without daring to actually lean into that uncertainty, you will not succeed in the same way.
No. And this is why the external environment, is so important, because there is that relationship that, and people think that it's all one way, that we anticipate something and we've done it, and that's where it's easy to post-rationalize and go, well, we made these decisions, and it's never like that. It's about the relationship, the coupling. There's changes in the external environment that you didn't anticipate, that you've responded to by it as an opportunity, or you reacted, and there's things that you've consciously chosen, and there is a mix of both. It's never one way. And actually, we could do the futures, and there'll be stuff that we didn't see. There is stuff that we didn't assume, but it happened. But the fact that we have done futures work and we've looked ahead, it gives us that, I call it scaffolding, that capacity to make sense of that far quicker than someone that is completely in the dark and surprised by this emergent thing that it just appeared.
Yeah, I fully agree. And two comments to that. First of all Harvard Business Review articles are based on one very, very smart person that saw everything.
Yes.
And people were thinking completely wrong about that, but I saw it, and this is what I did. And now look at this extreme success, right? It's dumbing down everyone around them. So that's not how the world is. But also to your point on this, I think what one of the biases that I think is extremely relevant in futures thinking is that we want, as human beings, we want to be right. We want to be smart. We want to see it. So if you're working with foresight as a future vision, then you build up, that's very often very utopian, right? But you build up this idea about how the future and how you would succeed. And then this is your story. And then when you see signals, things happening in your context, then you try to interpret these signals in a way that they confirm that you were right. But that's a dangerous way to do it. That's why you need to work with scenarios. You don't think about utopia and dystopia. Think about potential scenarios, the plausible futures. And if you think in multiple domains, as you say, then you train your brain for understanding dynamics in different environment. And when you understand dynamics in different environment, then you try to build your organization on a fundament of thriving in different dynamics. And that puts you ahead. So when you see a signal, it's not just confirming that your strategy is the best one. No, it makes you think about, does that lead to this scenario, this scenario, this scenario? And you get a much more, I should say, not hybrid, but ambidextrous in your thinking. And I think to your last point also, what I've worked a lot on is actually combining futures thinking with strategy and leadership. And that, triad, I think is, again, it's obvious, but I don't think it's prioritized sufficiently, because a lot of the drivers of change we see in the environment, the geopolitical situation we have now, it's not a surprise for anyone that U.S. is no longer the only real power in the world. So this multipolar world, we've spoken about that for decades, that it's going to happen. So it hasn't taken anyone by surprise. AI doesn't take anyone by surprise. So thinking about what does that do to your strategy, to your business model, and then again, what kind of culture, what kind of leadership style is needed in a future where we might need to be much more ambidextrous. We might need to have more focus on adaptability than lean. What does that need for our leadership? What does that, what kind of capabilities, what kind of conversations do we need? And most leaders are have a one-size-fits-all leadership style and believe that this culture in the organization, that's what I think is best. And that one-size-fits-all is very conveniently also suited to the style of leader you are, right? And that becomes a little bit how people think that then that's just a given. That is how we lead our organization. But I think we need to think in multiple scenarios and multiple leadership styles, organizational cultures, and we need to start focusing on pushing in the direction that we see the world is heading in, and hence also our organization.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a big challenge to that for a lot of leaders. One is the sort of embracing the perceptual complexity, the fact that, you know, we are in a collective system, but we all perceive things very differently and uniquely, and we're never going to be 100% aligned. And actually, to be able to take that view, you need to be able to recognize that. And I think that's where we need to step away from that hero leadership, that there is that one person that gets parachuted in and they solve the world. That's not true. And I think the other one is around this really understanding the identity of your organization, i.e. what actual culture, behaviors, what structures, what actual capabilities do you have? Because I think we live in this dualistic world, or self-created dualistic world, where we have what the organization actually is and what we perceive it to be by the story we tell ourselves. And this is the utopian bit. You see it. You only have to go to a few websites and you see our purpose is to blah this, or our thing, and our values are this, and it bears no recognition to what really is happening. And I think that makes it very difficult for them to then realize, with these futures, what does that really mean culturally, capability-wise, leadership-wise to us, if we don't really know ourselves.
Yeah, and we're actually working on a framework right now in order to combine those futures thinking with the hindsight thinking within organizational culture and within social phenomena. Because as we are working with what we call the futures cone, and maybe I'll do it like this, right? The further you go into the future, the wider the spectrum of uncertainty and potential futures. Whereas when we think back in time, we have an idea that the past was fixed.
Yes, linear.
The future doesn't exist, right? It will never exist. We will always be in the present. The history doesn't exist. It's also about the present. So both the future and the past is about perception. So whereas the future has a wide spectrum of potential, so has the past. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about what has happened, where we come from, who we are. And that is very flexible, right? So it's about working with those dynamics and understand where we came from. Understand that the stories about the past is also very divergent. So if we don't have an agreement on where we come from, where we're heading, then, you know, the different lines of trajectories of where we're going, that also becomes quite a complex conversation.
Yeah. And it'd be a useful exercise to look back and say, what were those key decisions that were made, and explore what actually drove those decisions and what were the other options.
And that's extremely interesting, right? Because when you look at economics, when you look at technology, when you look at very powerful decisions and so forth, all of that is very often something you can look back and get some tangible measures on. Whereas if you think about the culture, if you think about what did we actually think, what was our world view, was our perception, our assumptions when taking those decisions, you have no idea, right?
No.
So the latter you shape, so it's very convenient to the actual decisions. So you don't have a good historical understanding of how those two fits together. You have a good idea about how it looks in the present, right?
Yeah.
But what is extremely interesting is that many organizations is taking AI into the decision room now. So a lot of those conversations you're having, the conversations we're having, the conversations I am having with my colleagues, the conversations we're having in projects about assumptions, uncertainties, and so forth. Suddenly that is documented. Suddenly that becomes tangible.
Yeah.
Over time, we can actually connect that. And that's dangerous because that will reveal that a lot of our actions was just pure luck, right?
Yeah.
But also makes it much more, I would say, scientifical in a sense, that combining those. Because right now, I would say the way I'm assessed as my ability as an advisor, that's how likely I am as a person. That's how convinced I sound when I say things. And then what I deliver, how they feel, how good is this work? I don't think that it's about, over time saying what could be alternative decisions if we hadn't had this engagement and so forth. No one does that.
No.
So it's a little bit, we as advisors are measured on some weird stuff, right? Which is why most advisors say it's about sounding as convincing as possible without knowing anything, right?
Yes.
A little bit, toughly, roughly.
Yeah. I think looking back on some of those, if we used AI to really, challenge what actually happened, maybe be the paradigm shift that we're talking about in the fact that we need to get comfortable acting with limited information. There's no such thing as perfect information. We need to embrace these optionalities that, really test those. I call them like constraints wargaming. If this constraint that we believe to be true was to change, then what would that mean to us? How would that change the way that we would need to operate? But I think,
the sample size we're looking at, right? Most examples are like you mentioned NVIDIA, right? So of course NVIDIA has taken a lot of right decisions, and it's kind of like, I'm a bike rider, right? And when you're starting a bike race, you're 200 people and only one will win the race, right? And when you ask that person, what did you do, right? What they did was taking a lot of quite risky decisions, but that turned out right. So if you only ask the winner about how did you make your choice, right? They will mention a lot of bets they made, right? And then you think, okay, I just need to take a lot of bets and then I'm gonna win. No, just ask the one who got a DNF, did not finish, right? They all took risks, right?
yes.
So it's like if you're throwing the dice and see who will, and you are 10,000 people, someone will come out and they got 6 times 6 in a row. There will be someone who's doing that.
Yeah.
And is that because they're wise or were they just lucky, right? So there will be a lot of luck in the sample size of the extreme winners.
Yes. Yeah.
That's obvious, right? But it's just something we as human beings try to sometimes forget.
Yeah, I think that's definitely that thinking about, that one person that really brings in that sort of heroism. But, they must be the grand vision person.
Yeah.
Because they got all their bets right. When really, there's a lot you can learn from both around the decision making. And I suppose if anything, it's like you always, like even with your race analogy, the rider, they done what they could do beforehand to help, with those risky moves. They had the right training, they made sure they had the right capability, the right skill to do it. So, they helped in that way. It's all, but I think we need to distinguish between what is pure luck and what is anticipatory, that they set themselves up contextually to help the situation.
So when we hear some of these successful leaders saying, "This is what I did, this is what I pursued," then we will get OpenAI to reveal their chat story.
Yeah,
Cool.
Yeah, I'd love that. And I think this conversation has really highlighted the sort of the true need and the utility of futures. And for you in Denmark at the moment, it just shows you how crazy things can be. But as you said earlier, it wasn't a surprise. It surprised the people that aren't looking or not willing to look beyond that. So I really thank you for coming on to the show today. And before we leave, what would you like to leave listeners to go away and think about from this episode?
Basically, one thing that, even though it's difficult to work with and imagine the future, I think it's irresponsible not to engage with the future in a structured way, because it's a discipline like anything else, and it will actually improve your ability to take good decisions. So do yourself a favor, dive into this world of foresight and try to understand how to engage more structured with the future.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I always say to people, it's just practice. It's a discipline. So you practice it. You feel uncomfortable, but there'll be plenty of people in your team that
it doesn't feel nice in the beginning. But I think most decision makers know that it's not about living in a false comfort. It's about throwing yourself out there, and then you'll learn to manage this discipline as the rest of the disciplines.
And I think that bit earlier as well, we were talking about the formality, like when you're initially doing it, don't get too hepped up on process. Just go with it. Doesn't have to be perfect. The early stages. Yeah,
definitely.
I loved it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And for the listeners, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I have, please like and share to your community so they can get the benefit from these wise words and experience from Lasse today. So thank you so much for joining me, Lasse. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Great conversation.
Cheers. Yeah, same. Take care.